Hello, everybody, and welcome to 20 Effed Up Minutes with Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And if it wasn't immediately clear, this is a new segment kind of branching off of our regular podcast, Effed Up Stories. Just to clarify for you fans out there, this doesn't replace our normal podcast. It is in addition to. Essentially what this is going to do is a lot of you have been asking that we can be more regular with our shows. And so this show actually is going to serve a couple different purposes. So we can't do an hour plus podcast every week because we just don't have enough time to do one that's just, does the topic justice. But what we can do is these weekly 20-minute or 10 to 20 minute episodes, and that way it's giving you something regularly, and we'll still have our podcast about as consistent as we've always been with that. In the other purpose that it serves is that there's lots of great stories and topics and stuff like that our viewers have submitted on the website, and I know that not all of you are, everybody doesn't like to read. A lot of our fans just like to listen to the podcast. Well, this segment is centered on all of the submissions that we get. So there's all these great submissions that are great on their own, but they're not quite big enough to fill an hour-long podcast. And that's where this is going to fit in, because it's great content that can fit in 10 to 20 minutes. And that way, their story still gets some of the spotlight. You guys still get to hear some new stuff. And we have an assload of content dating back to 2 or 3 years of submissions. So, we have lots of content, so we're not going to be dry. So it serves that purpose. And, of course, it does serve the purpose of being more regular. And I would hope that it would, entice people to submit more often, because your stuff is most likely going to end up in one of these podcasts. Normally we're going to be picking these topics that are submitted at random, because like I said, we have a backlog of about 3 years, I guess, now. But we're going to start with a topic or actually a story that was submitted very recently. He's going to go by an anonymous name as Mike, something that is actually more frequent than you'd I'm sure you're aware of. We actually do have quite a few people that want to prefer to be anonymous, but are very well respected individuals in their professional fields. And of course, you can understand why they would want to be anonymous. But it's also good to point out that this kind of content isn't, or experiences aren't exclusive to the kind of people you'd expect. Lots of very well-respected individuals have these experiences as well. So without further ado, this story comes from someone named Mike. It's on the website, but we're going to go through it so you can listen to it, for those of you who don't like to read. So essentially, his story goes over 2 different experiences, and it kind of has an interesting outline at the end. So, both of these experiences happened around the same time, but he doesn't really remember which happened first. A lot of these stories are kind of in the back of your head, but certain details fade. But he does know that they happened around 1977, and he said he's sure that it happened around that time, because he used to watch this show called The Black Sheep Squadron. Now, I don't know what that is, but I'm sure plenty of you around that age would probably know what he's referring to. So this show apparently ran from 1976 to 1978. And he said that he moved to this house during the summer, and, this was 1976. And this first event that he's covering actually happened in the fall of November. November. So, anyway, it was a chilly night in the late November, and he was inside watching TV. And while he was watching TV, his brother and his friend were out in the front yard, and they were trying to find the northern lights. Apparently, they're sometimes viewable where he was too. So anyway, he was watching this, Mike was watching this Black Sheep Squadron TV show. And anyway, and he believes this was between like 7 to 9 p.m. And he stepped out into the front porch, to tell his brother it was on. I guess, that was their favorite show, apparently. And anyway, as he began to, call it to his brother interrupted him, and he said, with this, excited tone of voice, he says, "Mike, look." And, he points to the sky, and they both look up, and they see these two solid orange ovals, and they're flying through the air. And, he made a good emphasis on the fact that they were solid orange, not blinking like you often see with these things. They were very solid orange. They were moving south and southwest through the sky at different trajectories. And as they approached each other, they actually flew parallel for a few seconds, and then they separated, and they both kept heading up southwest, and then quickly, as he put it, faded from view. Now, he said he remembers this very vividly, I guess like you would. But his brother said that he didn't remember it at all. Like, his brother had no recollection that they had seen this thing. And it should be noted that, like, the house they lived in was roughly 1 mile away from the municipal airport, but he's never seen anything like that going to or from the airport. So, I mean, and for that matter, I don't think anybody really seen that kind of thing coming from an airport. One little thing I'd like to point out there, my own little note, is that I once seen lights in the sky that were pulsating across in an orangish color for about an hour before it turned to a blue. And actually, even me and you, Ryan, when we were on the old highway, that old story, it was an orange orb that initially had flown by us.
Yeah, certainly. And I've had my own experiences with what I refer to as a veritable fleet of orange orbs that at first appeared stationary, like they were stars, and then slowly began moving across the sky one by one. Ultimately by the dozens. So I guess the orange orb phenomena is not a unique one.
It's not isolated, and I guess it's just interesting to me because I've seen something somewhat resembling, you know what I mean? Like it hit me a little bit just because of my own experiences. So anyway, moving on to his, his other story, because I mean these happened around approximately the same time. His brother and he and his brother shared a bedroom. And on the main floor of their ranch-style house, and his brother, of course, doesn't remember. No, his brother does remember this event. That's right. I'm getting it mixed up. His brother does remember this event. So they were asleep one night, and he said it was either spring or fall because, the bedroom window was shut, and they didn't have air conditioning. So if it was summer, the window would have been open with the fan in it. So anyway, they're asleep when all of a sudden his brother's stereo turns on. And it not only turns on, but a noise starts coming from the speakers. And, not music is what I'm trying to say. The noise that comes from a speaker, it starts getting louder and louder to the point where, he's actually questioning how is the rest of my house not waking up to this? And the way he described the noise was a series of whoops, like whoop, whoop, that kind of a thing. This continued to get louder and louder and louder, and his brother did hear this, but the rest of the house didn't. So his brother jumps up, and he goes to turn off the stereo, but, the switch, the on-off switch, it was already in the off position. So that already struck them as odd. So, he flicks the switch a couple times, turn on, off, kind of a thing. And, the whoop sound is still going. So he's kind of perplexed by this. And then his brother unplugs the stereo. And yet the whooping continues. So this continues for about 4 or 5 more seconds after, it had been unplugged. And the sound kind of slowly fades away. And Mike, he told himself that there's probably a rational explanation. I mean, that's something that I think we all try to tell ourselves when we experience something so out of the normal that we can't come to, we can't explain, we can't come to terms with. But by his own admission, he's not an electronics guy, and he don't know if it could be an energy surge or something like that. But I mean, the way I looked at it was, if it was an energy surge, number one, it would most likely fry something, not give it just enough juice to work, right? I mean, that's why we have surge protectors, right? So it doesn't...
Yeah, well, I mean, even taking into account that perhaps they didn't have surge protectors in the, mid to late 70s, it still would be rather unusual to have a particular kind of an energy surge that would create a very specific repeatable noise in a system that, the on-off switch on a 1978 stereo, it's just going to be it's not just a push button generally. It's even if it is, it's literally disconnecting the power source from the stereo. And that right there in itself is strange. And I mean, while I gave this some thought, because I remember when I was younger, my grandmother had an old stereo, and when you hit the off button, it would stay on for a couple of seconds. And later I learned it was, because the thing had like a giant capacitor in it.
And storing energy.
It would store so much of a charge. But the idea that this mixture of strange electronic events just randomly occurred, along with all these other weird instances, just seemed rather unlikely.
Yeah, and again, I would assume that the surge, I mean, what are the chances that it would be, a proper...
affecting only one appliance?
Yeah,
too.
well, yeah, but like the proper amount of voltage and amperage to drive this device without destroying it, because I mean they're very fickle. They need an exact quantities of each. So, and as you said, and actually as he said, this didn't affect the bedroom lights, the alarm clock, or anything. It didn't affect anything else in the room, or I guess anything that would be on the same breaker. It only affected that stereo. Which again, that's I mean, you can't explain that, right? So then he goes on to say, fast forward a few years, and, he's in his late teens, beginning in his late teens, going through his 20s. He begins having these nightmares about UFOs. And for a while during this time, he stayed at his parents' house, the same house that, these other experiences have happened in. And there was a period of time where, like, he was having, sleeping problems. And he got to the point where he was actually scared to go to bed. The nightmares that he was having, like during this time that he was having trouble sleeping, all revolved around UFOs. He said he would virtually have the same dream every once in a while. And the dream was him standing either in his living room or outside the house. And, he described it like it felt like it was like 4 to 5 in the morning by the way the light was in the sky. That morning sky color. And all of a sudden, he'd get struck with this intense fear. It would just hit him like a ton of bricks. And, like, he had trouble, trying to describe it. He said never in his life has he been that frightened. And when that fear hit him, he had this distinct feeling that he knew, quote unquote, they were looking for him. And he would run into the house or down into the basement in this mad attempt to get away from whoever them was, or they, right? And then he would wake up and he'd be scared as hell. And he had this dream a lot over the years, but, he hasn't had it or any dream of UFOs since he hit 30. And, he says he said he'd come back to that in a moment. So he gives us a little back info, I guess, leading up to the current events. He said eventually he got married, he had kids, and he gets a house of his own, and he'd sometimes dream of snakes and spiders being in the bed, and he'd wake up and, he still continued to dream for a few seconds before realizing that he's still dreaming. And the dreams of spiders and snakes were frightening. But, the reason why he says this is because, again, he references back to his UFO dreams. And he says, none of those nightmares came even close to how scared he was with this UFO dream. And the reason why this is relevant, we're going to get to that in a minute. So these UFO dreams really left a scar on him. And anyway, like he would he woke up one of these nights when he was, having one with these snake dreams or whatever. And he wakes up and he looks towards his bedroom door, which was always left open because, he wanted to be able to hear his kids in the nighttime. And he looks at the door, and in floats a football-sized triangular object. Now, this object has rounded corners, it's black, and has different colored lights going around it. And he said it's floating basically 5 feet off the ground. It floats into the room, nearing the bed, and then it stops. At this time, he gets this impression that it stopped because it realized that he was watching it. He had this distinct impression again that that's why it stopped. And then it slowly backed out of the room. He didn't feel scared, just didn't know, like you would be. You wouldn't really know what's going on, what this thing is. And he finally told himself, this is a dream, and he just hadn't fully woken up, just like the snake nightmare and stuff like that. And he laid back down, he closed his eyes, but he didn't get back to sleep right away because, he was, wondering what the hell this thing was. So the reason why he wanted to mention these events is because he had this last major event that kind of ties this stuff together. He was never, he makes a point of saying he was never into UFOs when he was growing up. But when he would hear like a UFO or alien story, he thought it was kind of cool. But like he never interested enough to look into the topic and stuff like that. And, he said he did see UFOs a couple other times while he was awake, not dreaming, not in the bed. He saw a couple UFOs. But the point is that about the time where this thing floated into his bedroom, he goes outside and it's like 5 a.m. And, he looks into the sky and he saw what he described as a bright light or a bright star. And then all of a sudden, the star starts to move horizontally across the sky. And then it changed directions and moved up at what he believed to be a 45-degree angle. And then it faded away as if it was getting further away from him and headed into space. That's the way he described it. So he has all these like weird like alien, I guess pseudo-alien kind of tip-offs, but nothing really big yet, right? So that's all fine. Until he starts getting these alien dreams again, right? So he gets this dream, and he said this was like 1997, and he said this was this is the kicker. This is the one that's going to tie it all into a curiosity, I guess. He said it was by far the most fearful, frightening dream he's ever had. He was standing in a room, the light was dim, and he wasn't sure where this light was coming from, but there was this dim light, in the room, and then there was a Mr. Fog in the room. So he couldn't tell how big this room was. He was just in this dimly lit, foggy room. And then all of a sudden, he gets slammed, this big smack of that fear that he spoke about of these UFO dreams he had years and years and years ago. It was familiar, and he knew it was the same, whatever it was. It was connected. He hadn't had it for all these years, and all of a sudden here was this familiar, dreadful, distinctive fear. And he instantly, he was just terrified, and he found himself walking to a round window that he saw on a wall in this room. And he looked through the window, and he saw what he believed to be a gray alien standing there. And the gray alien looked at him, and it was holding what appeared to be a human baby. He screamed, he woke up, and he was scared. But this was the last UFO dream he's ever had. And here's where it gets weird. The weirdest part about this dream was that literally a day later, his wife told him that she was pregnant with their third child. And the part that freaked him out, the timing, the coincidence of the timing, is that he wonders if there's a connection between that dream and her pregnancy. And, the more I thought about the story, it seems like his whole life has kind of been peppered with these little, whether it's dreams, whether it's a couple, he sees a couple UFOs, he has that experience with the stereo, he sees that thing that floats into his room, and
it's almost how you would imagine a long-term observation,
exactly, like
little bits and pieces, kind of, they're trying to be secretive and whatnot, but every now and then, a little mistake is made, something's spotted,
and eventually it culminates into, you start putting these little pieces together, and all of a sudden you look at what appears to be that, and maybe he can't remember it. Maybe what he thinks was dreaming wasn't dreaming at all, because that is the case with a lot of UFO abductees, is that maybe he's had a life of actually being abducted by aliens. And I mean, by his own admission, the coincidence that he would have these, just to summarize and put it into perspective, he had these distinctive terrifying UFO dreams for years. And then he stopped having them for a long, long period of time. And when he finally does have it again, he recognizes the exact same kind of fear and feeling that he's had all those years ago. And, he's in a strange room. He looks through a window and he sees an alien with what appears to be a human baby. And then the very next day, his wife tells him she's pregnant.
Yeah, quite the coincidence, right? There's so many, quintessential earmarks of the UFO experience, detailed in the story. The missing memory of his brother, and something that's been popping up more and more are, electronic interference has always been a theme in a lot of different extraterrestrial or UFO kind of encounters, whether they're extraterrestrials or not. UFOs being their own phenomenon seem to accompany a lot of electronic, problems in one way or another, whether things shutting off or not working right or just spazzing out in general. And then there's one of the most interesting factors, and it's one of these things that seems to follow paranormal and UFO and all manner of high strangeness, as we call it today. But that idea of the supernatural fear that, like we've all been in situations where we're scared. You're out by yourself and you're approached by a group of thugs, or you think somebody's breaking into your house, or there's all kinds of situations that we've all been in our lives where we fear for our safety. But the how specific people are about this unnatural, intense, overwhelming fear. It's like it's its own special kind of fear. And
it's like identifiable to them, like it's distinctive. They recognize.
Like, I'd be scared if I walked up on a bear, but aliens and cryptozoological creatures seem to inspire their very own special kind of unnatural fear.
Almost like it radiates off the aliens themselves.
And that's and that is something that again is one of those earmarks of the paranormal / UFO experience, where it's like the fear was being projected into me, or they managed to summon some unnatural fear into my mind or something like that. And then we get to the I guess the real clincher, the cornerstone of the whole thing. And it's the most terrifying aspect, other than surgery and mutilation of the abduction phenomenon, but that of the interference with our children, with our DNA, with the very fabric of our human makeup is apparently in their control. And in this case, this guy has to wonder, is my child the product of alien interference?
And then he has to wonder if this is something that was planned throughout his whole life. Like the seeds were planted when he was young, and he was basically watched his whole life, and he wouldn't be the first one. So and
logically, that's how you would do an experiment, would you? You'd track the progress of the individual from young to old to see if they're viable as a specimen for whatever criteria that you set for your experiment. And after decades of observation, you make the move on it based off of the information you've gathered. Like whatever it was, 30 years of reconnaissance culminated in this, and perhaps the experiment is still ongoing.
Exactly. So what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? We would like to hear your opinions. And of course, if you have your own effed up story or idea, picture, video, or whatever, we do want to hear it. You can submit that to us at our official site, www.effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. And of course, we're going to be doing these little mini podcasts more regularly, so you should have more regular content. And of course, I'm sure you'll let us know if you like the idea or not in the comments without us even asking you. So we look forward to seeing what you have to say. And of course, be on the lookout next weekend, because we're hoping to do our Christmas podcast. That's the real full-size, big badass podcast that we've been planning. So be sure to tune in for that. And with that having been said, I hope you have an effed up week. Have a good
night,
one.
everybody.
Or actually a story that was submitted very recently. He's going to go by an anonymous name as Mike, something that is actually more frequent than you'd I'm sure you're aware of. We actually do have quite a few people that want to prefer to be anonymous, but are very well respected individuals in their professional fields. And of course, you can understand why they would want to be anonymous. But it's also good to point out that this kind of content isn't, or experiences aren't exclusive to the kind of people you'd expect. This show actually is going to serve a couple different purposes. So we can't do an hour-plus podcast every week because we just don't have enough time to do one that's just, does the topic justice. But what we can do is these weekly 20-minute or 10 to 20-minute episodes, and that way it's giving you something regularly, and we'll still have our podcast about as consistent as we've always been with that. In the other purpose that it serves is that there's lots of great stories and topics and stuff like that our viewers have submitted on the website, and I know that not all of you are, everybody doesn't like to read. A lot of our fans just like to listen to the podcast. Well, this segment is centered on all of the submissions that we get. So there's all these great submissions that are great on their own, but they're not quite big enough to fill an hour-long podcast. And that's where this is going to fit in, because it's great content that can fit in 10 to 20 minutes. And that way, their story still gets some of the spotlight. You guys still get to hear some new stuff. And we have an assload of content dating back to 2 or 3 years of submissions. So, we have lots of content, so we're not going to be dry. So it serves that purpose. And, of course, it does serve the purpose of being more regular. And I would hope that it would, entice people to submit more often, because your stuff is most likely going to end up in one of these podcasts. Normally we're going to be picking these topics that are submitted at random, because like I said, we have a backlog of about 3 years, I guess, now. But we're going to start with a topic that... Hello, everybody, and welcome to 20 Effed Up Minutes with Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And if it wasn't immediately clear, this is a new segment kind of branching off of our regular podcast of stories. Just to clarify for you fans out there, this doesn't replace our normal podcast. It is in addition to. Essentially what this is going to do is a lot of you have been asking that we can be more regular with our shows. And so this